Life's treasures come in many shapes and sizes. But how do we keep those treasures safe, and what's really inside a real-life treasure box? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. So today I'm building a box for storing life's smaller treasures. From rings to bracelets, or if your kid's anything like mine, it might hold a few finger puppets and bouncy balls from the mini golf arcade. So the first step in this treasure box making venture is to tackle the brittle veneer that will encompass my mini case. And I'll do that by first trimming my veneer down to more manageable slices using a veneer saw and a jointed board as a guide. Here I just use very light pressure and make multiple passes until the saw is through the veneer. Since I'm using white oak burl for the veneer, the thin sheets are pretty brittle, so next I'll spritz them down with some veneer softener. From there I can stack the sheets with some paper between them to absorb the excess liquid. When stacking the sheets, I recommend going no more than 3 sheets at a time, otherwise they can get kinda wonky. Then I can add a flat sheet of MDF along with a few weights to hold things down. Now, if you don't have a pair of kettlebells like I do here, a fire extinguisher or two should do the trick. Safety first. So while those sheets dry over the next 24 hours or so, I can go ahead and start making my MDF cores for the box. The first thing I need to do here is cut down the 4 strips I need to make the box sides, as well as my top and bottom. Now, the reason I'm going with MDF rather than hardwood for this box is that when using more exotic lumbers like burl and really figured hardwoods, it's a lot easier to find them in veneer form. And that's because the most figured logs end up as veneer rather than dimensional lumber, as lumber suppliers can get a lot more bang for their buck that way. But beyond that, it also allows for some fun reveals to be built in the box's structure, and we'll get more into that as we go. So if we want some of those reveals to exist, we first need to insert some contrasting lumber species into our core. And for that, I'm going to be using walnut. The dark nature of walnut hardwood contrasts nicely with the lighter color of the white oak, which will add a bit of drama and some visual interest to the design. So the first step here is to flatten one edge and one face over at the joiner, then I can take the workpieces over to the planer to thickness them down. When working with smaller projects, it's super important to get your workpieces as flat and square as possible. And that's because there's a lot less forgiveness as you scale projects down. For larger pieces, there may be a tolerance of a 32nd to a 64th of an inch, whereas with a small box like this one, those tolerances go down to 1/28th of an inch or 0.2 millimeters for my international viewers. Yep, still decilingual. So with the board's thickness down, I'll roughly cut out my strips over at the table saw. My goal here is to get those boards a hair oversized, this way I can sand the walnut flush to the thickness of the MDF once my cores are assembled. And if you guys are looking for the exact dimensions of this box, just let me know in the comments if you want plans, and as always, if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. Over at the workbench, the next step is to label all my workpieces and lay out my box cores. I'm going to be using walnut for the top and bottom of the core, as well as a thin strip where the box will be separated to create the lid. This is where we'll get those fun reveals I spoke about earlier. Now to glue up the panels, I'd like to create a quick panel clamp with some scrap plywood. This way I can ensure that my cores stay flat and aligned during the glue up. From there, it's just a matter of creating our MDF sandwiches, substituting Type Bond 1 as mayo. And if mayo isn't your thing, sorry, we can call it mustard. So once I have all my strips in place, I can use a non-marring mallet to tap them flat and square, then knock home my wedge to clamp them up. Now, when making a panel clamp, it's really important that you line the lower portion with packing tape. Otherwise, you're going to create a clamp with a panel that you can't remove, which I guess then would be the true definition of what a panel clamp is. Anyway, after about an hour in the clamp, I can go ahead and pop the panels out and give them a quick sand with 180 grit. Again here, I'm just trying to knock down the walnut so that it's flush with the MDF. I definitely don't want to sand so much that I create any divots or uneven areas in my panel, so nothing but light pressure for this part. From there, I'll let the panel sit overnight to allow the glue to fully cure. Then, the next day, I could come back in the shop and trim down my softened tree slices. When working with veneer, it's really important that your veneer be slightly under the overall size of your substrate. This way you reduce the risk of cracking the veneer when applying clamping pressure. Again here, I'm going to use my veneer saw on a self-healing mat to trim down my sections. When cross-cutting a few pieces of veneer at a time, I like to use a bit of masking tape to hold my workpieces together. This way I can ensure all my parts are dimensioned properly and prevent tear out. So with all the veneer trimmed down, it was time to attach it to my substrate. Now you could do this a couple different ways, from using cold press glue to just Type Bond 1. but I prefer to use epoxy as it dries really hard and prevents the veneer from creeping over time. An added benefit of using epoxy is that I'm able to tint the epoxy to hide some of the defects in the burl. So the best way that I found to apply epoxy is just to roll it out first on the slab, which can just be a scrap piece of wood, and then from there I'll apply a thin coat to my substrate. It's important not to oversaturate your substrate, as doing so will cause the epoxy to bleed through the veneer once it's clamped up. It's also a good idea to use something like freezer paper or wax paper on the outside of your veneer to prevent any bleed through from getting on your equipment. Here I'm attaching veneer to both sides of the box sides and only the down-facing face of the box top, and we'll get into why shortly. Now, to clamp up my veneered panels, I'm going to be using a vacuum press. But if you don't own a vacuum press, you can just use some clamps with plywood sheets and some clamping cauls and clamps to hold your veneer in place. I think the other added benefit of using epoxy is that it gives you a lot of working time, so you don't have to rush through this process. Once I have the veneer in place, I'll pop my panels in the vacuum press for about 10 hours to cure. I should note that if you're using fast cure epoxy, you only have to wait about 4 hours, but I'm using slow here, so I'll just let them sit. With the epoxy reaching its set phase, I could go ahead and pop the panels out of the vacuum press and inspect them for any delaminations. With everything looking good, I went ahead and stickered them so the epoxy could continue to harden completely. Now, even with the suction from the vacuum press pulling a marginal amount of the epoxy through the voids in the front of the burl, I still had a few areas that needed to be addressed. One option is to mix up more epoxy, but the more immediate solution is just to use some pre-dyed CA glue. For any hairline cracks or checks in the veneer, I'll opt for a dab of TB1. From there, I'll use my random orbit sander to lightly sand my panels with 180 grit. Again, here it's important to use little to no pressure, as I don't want to sand through the veneer. And speaking of no pressure, if you're enjoying this video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. Next, I could lay out the final dimension of my box top and tape off my glue area with some masking tape. I'm going to be applying sand sealer to all my parts, so taping off the glue area prevents the finish from seeping in. To apply the sand sealer, I'm just going to use a foam brush and give my workpieces a light coat. This finish just acts as protection at this point and prevents the veneer from getting nicked up throughout the build process. Kind of like a Trojan for your wood. Apropos, I know. After about 20 minutes, the sand sealer's dry, so I headed over to the table saw to rip the panels down to their final width. Again, this is why I made these panels slightly oversized, because if I made them to their final size right from the start, I could have uneven edges on the veneer. By trimming them down after the fact though, I don't have to worry about that at all. Smarter, not harder. With my side panels trimmed to their final width, it was time to cut the rabbets along the top and bottom for the top and bottom. First, I'll use my calipers to measure the exact thickness of my top panel, then set my fence accordingly, nudging it closer to the blade equal to that dimension. From there, I can set the blade height to just below 5/16 of an inch, then make the cuts in the top of the box. Once I have my initial cut for the top in place, I'll nudge the fence again towards the blade to make the cut for the bottom. Here I'm only moving the fence about a 32nd of an inch, and that's because my box bottom is going to be slightly thicker than the box top once I have my suede applied. To remove the remaining material, I'll raise the blade so that it's exposed through my previous cuts. Then holding my workpieces vertically against the fence, I'll make the cuts, being careful to keep firm pressure on the side. My final dimension on the outer wall is going to be 3/16 of an inch here, but I don't want to get there at the table saw. Instead, I'm going to finish these rabbets over at the router table. So here, all my rabbet joints are just slightly oversized. Over at the router table, I can pop in a 1/2 inch spiral down cut bit and set my fence and bit to that final 1/2 inch by 3/8 of an inch dimension. Normally at a router table, you work left to right with your workpiece as the bit spins counterclockwise. But here I'm going to use a climb cut, meaning that I'm going to cut with the direction of the bit left to right. This results in a cleaner cut and less tear out, but it's a more dangerous type of cut since your workpiece theoretically could be launched into your next door neighbor's house. So if you're not comfortable or confident doing a climb cut, don't. A traditional cut will work just as well, it just won't have that superior finish. Once I've routed the rabbets in for the box bottom, I can nudge the fence over and route the rabbets for the top. Again, the top and bottom rabbets are just slightly different sizes here. Next, it was time to route in the glue groove. To do that, I'm just going to use a 1/16 of an inch router bit and flip my workpiece vertically against the fence while I make the cuts. The groove is going to allow for any excess glue squeeze out to run out of the joint into this trough rather than inside the box. It's one of those steps that isn't completely necessary, but does make cleanup a hell of a lot easier. With the trough routed in place, it was time to move on to cutting the miters for the box sides. But before I do that, I need to lay out where-ish I want the joints to live. So over at the bench, I'll use a few squares to mark out the rough location for my miters, then from there I can head over to the bandsaw to cut the panels into 4 sections. No matter which way I cut my miters, I'm going to end up removing a little bit of material from the center of those joints where the grain aligns. But by starting at the bandsaw, I can cut those joints tighter than I can just using the table saw. And that's because my table saw blade is an 1/8 inch thick, meaning that I'm going to remove 1/8 of an inch with my initial cut, plus a little bit more for the adjoining cut, versus the bandsaw where the curve of the blade is more like a 32nd of an inch. Once I've tilted my blade at the table saw to 45 degrees, I can just kiss the end of my workpiece to the edge of the tilted blade and make my cuts. This will result in a maximum of 1/8 of material removed, but if done properly, it's probably closer to a 1/16 of an inch. After my initial cut, I'll just use the stop as reference to cut all my workpieces to the same length. That's why earlier I said that I was laying out where-ish I wanted the joints to live, because ultimately the stop is going to determine the actual location. I guess I really am here just to make suggestions, because at the end of the day, my tools do the deciding. Thankfully here my tools decided to play ball, and I could next tape up my joints for a dry assembly. I love using masking tape or painter's tape for this procedure because there's a little stretch that pulls those joints tight, and it also helps to align the outside edge of the miter joints. Yep, cutting corners is definitely my thing. Next it was time to cut the box top to its final dimension, and to get that final dimension, I'll use a bar gauge. With my measurements quite literally in hand, I headed over to the table saw to rough cut the first 2 edges oversized. From there I can readjust the fence to the exact width of my bar gauge and make the final 2 cuts. With all 4 sides trimmed down, it was now time for the moment of truth. And yes, I may have fumbled the initial insertion like a 50-cent first pitch, but once I got settled in, the panel went in smoother than a fresh coat of shellac. And that's actually a pretty solid transition for the next phase of the project, which is the finish for the interior of the box. So the first step is to lightly sand back the sand sealer I applied earlier with some 220 grit. From there, I need to remove any dust from the surface utilizing a vacuum. It's really important to pull away any excess dust from a project like this, otherwise you could pack in the residue and that will result in a poor quality finish. Once I've sanded all the inside facing surfaces, the next step is to use a 00 Scotch-Brite pad to further smooth them out. I made mine from a standard pad and some Velcro I had lying around, but they do make pre-cut pads for your random orbit sander. Once I'm satisfied with the smoothness of the surface, I'll again vacuum away any surface debris. From there, I can tape off my glue area again, and then I'm on to applying the wax. When applying wax polish to a piece, it's important to work with a minimal amount at a time. You don't want to start with a large clump of wax and then have to buff it out for the rest of the day. Instead, work with about a dime size at a time and stretch it as far as you can go. From there, I like to buff the wax again with a white Scotch-Brite pad just to remove any excess. It's also best to just work in sections to make sure you don't overcoat your surfaces. And if you happen to be making a box like this one, be mindful not to get the wax in the miters, as that will prevent the glue from doing its job later on. But through this process, you'll end up with a surface that's about as smooth as glass. From there, it's on to the glue up. So here I've already pre-taped the outside of all my miter joints, with the exception of the 2 open ends. I also went ahead and applied a bit of tape to the interior of those joints to prevent any squeeze out from getting on the freshly finished surface. So the glue up here just really goes as any mitered box would, where I apply a minimal amount of glue to each miter joint and then squeeze them shut with the masking tape. I also added a few strap clamps to hold those joints tight, and once I have the top in place, I just use a few F-style clamps to hold it down to the bench. After about an hour in clamps, I could go ahead and remove the masking tape and see how those miters turned out. Thankfully everything aligned perfectly, and any squeeze out was caught by the masking tape. From there, I can use my random orbit sander to knock down the top edge of the box. I don't want to sand a lot here, just enough to even up the surface. With everything nice and smooth, I can again mix up some epoxy to attach the top. It's a good idea here to give yourself an indicator for the orientation of the veneer, and I just do that with a small piece of tape. To hold the veneer flat, I'm going to flip the box upside down and use a couple pieces of foam on the interior to even out the clamping pressure. Then I can just clamp the box to the bench top. Now, unfortunately for me, this wasn't sufficient enough, and you're going to see that shortly. It is true what they say, you can never have enough clamps. So with the box out of clamps, I could go ahead and knock back any overhang I had on the veneer. And I probably should have prefaced that earlier that this is slightly oversized because I'm not worried about cracking in this situation, but we're here now. So once I've knocked those edges back, I can again follow the same procedure as earlier and prepare the surface for sand sealer. And it was in this moment where things started to derail. I noticed that as the sand sealer dried, I was starting to get bubbles in my veneer, which is no bueno. So I decided to make the repair utilizing an X-Acto knife and a bit of epoxy. Now, I've used this method plenty of times in the past without consequence. This time though, I think I was a little overambitious. I neglected to tape off my surface before making the cuts, which meant that any epoxy that squeezed out embedded itself into the exposed wood grain. Honestly, that's just an oversight on my part, and not paying attention in the shop this time burned me. So while I did attempt to sand down the surface to save this piece of veneer, unfortunately in this case, I just decided we're going to do a round two. Now luckily for me that's easy enough to do, and the second time around I made sure to use a bit more epoxy and more foam for added clamping pressure. Now I'm aware that mistakes like this happen all the time in the shop, so let me know down in the comments if you have any shop stories like this one. But if you're lucky enough not to have any major mistakes happen to you, start your comment with lucky. And if you're like me and you've learned the hard way, start your comment with experience. As always, if you start your comment with lucky or experience, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. And bonus points if you share your story. The next step in the venture is to flatten the base of the box, and I'll just do that with a sanding board clamped to the top of my table saw. Doing this ensures that the board remains completely flat during the process and results in a perfectly flat bottom. I also like to add a bit of baby powder to the surface to act as a lubricator and reduce friction. Working at a 45-degree angle also ensures that I don't flatten one edge more than the other. From there, it's over to set up the router table to cut the chamfers on the top and bottom edges of the box. This is why I included the walnut at the top and base of my core glue-ups. Doing so allows for a slight reveal around the top and bottom edges, which I think looks really good. There's a lot of other details you could get into for the edges at this point, including inlays, so this is an opportunity to experiment a bit in the future. In this setup, I use a scrap piece of 1/4-inch plywood to make the cut more of a zero clearance kind of deal. Ultimately, I just don't want the bearing for the bit riding against the side of my box. With the bevels in place, I can give the entire exterior a quick sanding and run through the final finish process again. It's probably a little odd to many people to see the finish occur so early in a project, but once the finish is applied, I'm going to protect the exterior of the box for the remainder of the project using some masking tape and cardstock. The main reason for applying finish now is to prevent the veneer from any future abuse. So once I've added a micro bevel to the corners of my box, I can go ahead and sand everything up to 220, then apply the sand sealer. From there, I'll again use my 00 Scotch-Brite pad, then apply the wax polish. And thankfully, through the magic of editing, that 3-hour process only takes 33 seconds. As I mentioned, with the finish applied, next I could protect the exterior of the box using masking tape and a bit of cardstock for the top. I know it may not seem like much, but masking tape is actually plenty of material to lift the box off machine surfaces, so this step is well worth the time. Next up was one of the most make or break parts of this project, and that was to separate the lid from the base. What I'll do first is create a quick zero clearance insert, just using some scrap MDF. And with that locked in place, it's on to cutting the top. To do that, I'm going to be using my bandsaw and a 3/4-inch 6 TPI blade. The most important part of this step is to use a newish sharp blade along with a tall fence. From there, you just have to full send and hope for the best. So with that massive hurdle behind us, next I could clean up the saw marks using a block plane. Now, if you're not comfortable using a block plane in this situation, you could jump straight into sanding these parts flat, Just be aware that it may take a bit longer doing it that way. Back over at the sanding board, I'll flatten both the top and bottom pieces using 180 grit, then replace the 180 with 220 and give them a final smoothing. This will make my top and base meet with a harmonious alignment. Yes, it's almost as if they were made for each other. With the marriage of my top and bottom complete, we're on to the honeymoon where I need to cut the mortises for my hinges so these two will remain conjoined forever. So after I've set the stops on my router table, I'll next cut the mortises into a test block, which will become the reference for marking the mortises on my box. Now that setup process did take a bit of time, so make sure you do your due diligence and make sure your mortises are aligned correctly before hopping into cutting them into your box. At the router table, I'm going to place my box parts down on the surface and carefully cut the mortises to the stop. And even though I marked the cut out beforehand on the rear of my box, I did have one corner tear out, and you can see that here. So I'll show you how I fix that in a moment. But once I have one pair of mortises complete, I'll flip down my other stop and cut in the second pair. To repair my corner, I just cut off a small piece from my earlier mitered edges and glued it in place with some CA glue. This is one of those I won't tell if you won't tell type of repairs. Now, if I'm being honest, I think the only bummer part of using this hinge set is that it requires a 1/16 of an inch extra cut to be made on the rear of the box to allow the hinges to open and close. There are other hinge brands that don't require this added step, but they were all sold out when I was doing this project, so as my son's teacher says, we get what we get and we don't throw a fit. So to remove that material, I'm just going to use my chisels and some terrible camera angles to show you how I did it. Yeah, I'll admit that wasn't my finest camera work, but the mortises did turn out really well, right? Next, I needed to mark the location for the mounting screws. And to do that, I'm just going to use a slightly oversized bit that fits right inside the number 2 screw holes and a tiny hammer. Apparently they make a jig for this too, but you can save yourself a couple bucks and just YOLO it like me. From there I'll tape off a 1/16 of an inch bit and plunge in my pilot holes. And as a side note, my flag is about a 1/16 of an inch shallower than the actual depth of the screws, just so there's something for the end to grab onto. Just the tip. So next I wanted to create a subtle bevel around the area where the lid meets the base. Now, because these parts are pretty delicate at this point, I'm not going to carve them at the router table. Instead, I'm going to hand sand them, aiming for a 45-degree angle. This will expose a bit of that walnut hiding underneath, and again, give the box a bit more character. Once I've taped off the area, I'll use a combination of a 180 grit sanding block and a 220 grit sanding block to carve in the chamfer. Next, I can apply the finish for the top of the box and the bottom of the lid, again following the same steps as before. When finishing the areas near the hinge mortises, it's a good idea to work away from those areas so you don't pull the mortises with the finish. From there, it's on to trimming down the box bottom. Now, I'm going to offset the bottom of the box slightly because the thickness of my suede is about a 1/16 of an inch. So if I cut my bottom full width, there's not going to be any room for the suede. Instead, I'll offset it by 3/32 to give me a little bit more space. I'm also going to tilt my blade by 3 degrees just to make it easier to fit the bottom into the box. This way the suede will fit snug but not blow out my joinery. So here my initial cuts are slightly larger than I need my panel to be. And once I have those initial bevels cut in place, I'll set my fence to the final width and make the remaining 2 cuts. Back over at the bench, I'll just use some double-sided tape to adhere the suede to my MDF. So once I've cut out strips for the bottom, I'll trim down some strips for the sides, remove the adhesive, and drop the panel onto my suede. Then I just need to wrap the MDF panel with the suede, and I'll do that by trimming down one side at a time. When I get to the corners, I'll just make a Y sort of incision, then fold the material up and trim it flush. If the corners do poke out a little bit, I can just use an X-Acto knife to press them in later. But definitely don't cut corners here, we only do that on wood. From there, all I need to do is apply a bead of glue to the underside of my box, then drop the panel in place. I should also note that the wedge shape for the bottom does face up in the same orientation it's cut at the table saw. Once the suede panel is fully seated, a scrap piece of plywood and some parallel clamps hold it in place while the glue dries. So, while the glue cures, the next phase of the project consists of creating an interlocking divider. Since this box is a square, I'm going to divide that square into 4 squares to help organize those special treasures. So, I first milled down a board of walnut, then trim it to 3/8 of an inch over the depth of the interior of the box. And the reason I'm going with 3/8 of an inch over is because that's the thickness of my material here. I really wanted to play off the 45-degree bevels with this insert, so again here I'm going to cut some corners, but it's with good reason. So once I have the inserts cut to the proper length and height, I can go ahead and trim off those corners. From there, I'll sand the material down before laying out the joinery. And the joint I'm going for here is just a cross-lap joint. So once I've marked out the upper center portion on one workpiece and the lower center portion on the other, I can head over to the table saw and set up a 3/8 inch dado stack. When cutting joinery like this, I find it easiest to just tape my 2 workpieces together and cut the joints at the same time. The only risk here is if there's any wonkiness in the joinery, it's going to be off on both pieces. But on the plus side, you only have to nail the joint one time. So it's a little high risk, high reward, but worth it. With the dividers assembled, I could mark out the center location on the upper section, then commence round 4 of bevel sanding. I marked out the center here because if I sand that area over, it's going to look really wonky when the 2 joints come together. So while I wrap that up, let me take a moment to say thank you to you guys for watching, commenting, and sharing these videos. I work on these projects and videos on nights and weekends, so having the support from you guys means the world. That said, if you'd like to support the channel further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you can join a community of fellow woodworkers who enjoy chatting about the craft, their own shops and projects, and insights about what I'm working on. You'll also get discounts on project plans and merchandise, and full access to the Discord server. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link in the description below. And as always, to those of you who have already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. So the final step on this one was to cut down the suede for the interior of the box. I first trimmed out a piece of cardstock and fit it to the floor of the box, then I used it as reference for trimming down my actual suede. Again here, double stick tape holds the suede to the cardstock, and I can glue the entire sandwich into the box using 2nd grade school glue, the finest of all the glues. When inserting the floor, I find it easiest to curl the suede into place, then press the corners using an awl. I've also found it helpful to have a scrap piece of wood to help push the edges against the sides, and once the suede's in place, I'll use a few pieces of foam and a clamp to hold it down. And learning from my previous experience, an extra piece of foam here doesn't hurt. Once the glue is dry, I can go ahead and pop in the screws for the hinges and attach the top to the base. Now, if your hinges don't sit completely flush here, you can pop on 1 or 2 pieces of masking tape to the underside, which will lift those hinges just enough to allow them to close. And though I didn't have to do that here, it is something I've had to do in the past. From there I can brush the suede one last time with a vacuum, place in my divider, and finally remove the protective cardstock from the top. And now, this box is ready for some treasure. And just like that, a stack of brittle white oak burl veneer and plain Jane MDF transformed into a pint-sized Fort Knox. The exterior, a swirling burl surface that looks like Mother Nature's own marbled cheesecake, framed by crisp walnut reveals and beveled corners that catch the light just right. Crack it open, and you're greeted by suede-lined compartments, 4 tidy little bays ready for heirloom rings, rogue finger puppets, or that Lego that your kid swears is super rare. Side rail brass hinges let the lid float open with a satisfying whisper, while a micro bevel around the seams shows off a subtle ribbon of walnut like a pinstripe on a classic muscle car. Yep, this is what treasures deserve. So, if you're ready to embark on another woodworking adventure, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.